The Atari Lynx continues to be one of the most underappreciated systems in video game history. Now, part of that is because it did get legitimately blown out of the water by its competition, despite making a little bit of a splash initially with its large screen and fairly impressive specs. Ultimately, though, the firm grasp on the handheld market that Nintendo already had with the insanely popular Game Boy and the aggressive marketing of Sega's Game Gear just didn't leave a lot of room for a third contender, which immediately led to soft sales for the Lynx, which made it even harder to find in stores, which led to even worse sales, and that cycle repeated until it was finally taken behind the barn and old yellered by Atari in 1995. But today, we don't really have that excuse. Now, while the system itself isn't what I would call cheap, the games are often pretty reasonable. You can get most of them for $30 or less. And while I highly recommend upgrading the screen, you don't necessarily have to do that to be up and running. Plus, emulation exists. Just putting that out there. No matter how you approach the Lynx, though, this is a library absolutely worth exploring. Dare I say, it's maybe one of Atari's better lineups, with a lot of surprisingly accurate arcade ports and a handful of exclusives that you just can't play anywhere else. Now, these games are pretty simple, and they definitely have their limitations, but, I mean, they got me through a lot of long family car rides when I was a kid, and if you ask me, I think a lot of them still hold up today. Although you didn't ask me, but here we are. Crystal Mines 2 is one of my absolute favorites on the Lynx, and that's because it gets basically everything right. This is a 2D puzzle shooter game with a little bit of Dig Dug and a little bit of Bomberman thrown in for good measure. You hunt down crystals, shoot monsters, uncover secrets, get crushed by the occasional boulder, and eventually escape to the next stage where you'll do it all over again. The levels steadily increase in size and complexity with new enemies, abilities, and block types popping up every so often. The bombs are the most common secondary ability that you'll use in sort of a Bomberman fashion to clear out bedrock and even some enemies. Some enemies need to be blown up though and will not respond to your regular gun, while others explode and take everything out around them. Some rocks are the same way and can quickly become hazards if you aren't careful. So figuring out how to best deal with different enemies and rock types, some of which are just straight up invincible, and some of which are just better off avoided, is pretty much a process of trial and error, and can lead to a few "how the hell was I supposed to know that" moments. But unlimited lives and a password system pretty much ensure that if you're dedicated enough, you can, in theory, get through the whole game. Now, I personally find the game far too addictive and engrossing to get hung up on a couple of cheap deaths, and I suspect most of you will too if you give it a chance. I gotta give a big shout out to the music here. This might actually be my favorite collection of tunes in the entire Lynx library. Now, like most of the games on the Lynx, there's only a few tracks, and they are reused a lot, but man, they are absolute bangers. The excellent mixing with sound effects is also nice, as neither they or the music overpower each other ever. It's just perfect sound design all around. The graphics are pretty good too. You won't see quite as much color in Crystal Mines as you might in a lot of other Lynx games, with a lot of browns and grays kind of dominating the stage to sell the underground setting, but when the game does give you color, it pops off the backgrounds really well. I find the graphics of Crystal Mines 2 quite appealing overall. It's able to craft its own identity with fun characters, some great animation work, and a good sense of variety, all while staying easy on the eyes and leaving the Lynx plenty of headroom to run it all relatively well. The game keeps you guessing too with interesting layouts. Also, if you do some exploring, you'll find some weak walls that you can shoot through to get some extra crystals and run up the score. There's actually a lot of this in the game, so if you're obsessed with discovering secret areas like I am, there's a huge increase in the fun factor right there. On top of having an abundance of content, well over 150 levels if you count the bonus stages, Crystal Mines 2 brings tight gameplay and fantastic production values to back it up. While I don't play as much Lynx as I used to when I was a kid, I can always come back to this game for a short 10 or 15 minute session, or an entire afternoon. It's a must play if there ever was one. Though not really known as a console for shooters, the Lynx does have a couple of pretty good ones. The best of them, in my view, is Gates of Zendon. A giant horrible space spider thing has created an evil web of universes, but has conveniently connected them all with a series of gates. So now it's time to use those gates against him to destroy it all. As a launch title and an exclusive for the Lynx, Gates of Zendon is able to flex every pixel of that 3.5-inch screen and all 4 channels of its stereo sound system. This screen ratio is actually perfect for horizontal shoot-'em-ups, so I'm kinda surprised that we didn't see more of them on the Lynx. This game also packs a surprising amount of longevity for a 1989 handheld game with a ton of levels. Each area generally has 1 or 2 enemy types which don't take more than a couple of seconds of uninterrupted fire from your laser before they explode in a fiery demise. As long as you're holding the fire button, the beam will be active, but every time you press it, the ship also releases a little bomb that can help you hit enemies down below and in other hard-to-reach spots. So tapping the fire button repeatedly is generally the way to go. You also do have a shield that you can use once per life, but you can't shoot while using it, so it's pretty situational. Other power-ups also come along from time to time, like this little dude that seeks enemies out and damages them automatically, and this floating eyeball that provides a little extra firepower. The interdimensional theme of the game gives the developers a license to go pretty wild with enemy designs, and that they do. They make a pretty good attempt at level variety too, although most of them are only differentiated by the static background images. Although every now and then they will throw some curveballs your way with obstacles and more complex enemies that will engage your brain a little bit more. So you do get the sense that the developers over at Epic Software were really trying to do their best within the confines of the system. I like how your ship can actually sort of fall apart as you take damage, like here where I lost my laser and could only use the bombs until I was able to swap out my battered ship for a brand new one. The music here is also pretty good, all things considered. There's a small handful of catchy tunes that are pleasant to the ear and give the game some of its personality. There's not a whole lot to work with on the Lynx when it comes to sound, but some games just manage to squeeze a lot out of it anyway. And Gates of Zendon is a decent example of that. Sound effects are also pretty decent, although maybe a little bit loud compared to the music, but it's not too distracting. Overall, the audio here is pretty good all around. Nothing screechy or tinny, and everything's pretty clear. My only real gripe with this game is the movement that seems to have some kind of momentum system, but I can't ever get a handle on it. Sometimes it seems to speed up naturally as you hold down a direction, and sometimes it just doesn't. Not sure what that's about, but I would have just preferred to not have momentum at all. Also, when there's a lot going on, the game does suffer a little bit of slowdown, which can kind of throw you off. It's not too bad, and it usually doesn't last very long, but it is noticeable. Supposedly there were plans for a dramatically upgraded version of this game for the Atari Jaguar, but they fell through at some point. Kind of interesting to think about how this could have evolved if it had been allowed to become a series. Gates of Zendon might not blow the doors off of the genre, but it certainly stands tall in the limited selection of shooters you could get on handhelds of its time. And I think it's a perfectly solid way to kill an hour or so. The levels are short and sweet, the enemy variety and music are surprisingly good, and the additional weapons and abilities make it feel a little bit more fully featured than a lot of handheld shoot-'em-ups of its time. I think it's worth a try for most people. Now, I'm kind of picky about puzzle games. Some of them I absolutely adore, but with a lot of them I tend to get stuck somewhere along the way and ultimately lose interest. And I'd be lying if I said that never happens in Chip's Challenge, but I still think this is one of the better puzzle games I've played and easily one of the best games on the Lynx overall. Chip is really excited about joining some nerdy computer club and has to complete an ungodly 144 challenges to do it. But he's a motivated guy and decides to go for it. Or maybe he just has a lot of time on his hands. The levels are extremely well designed here and all center around different concepts that set them apart. Some have locked doors that need keys, some have enemies that need to be avoided by studying their movements. Some have elemental variables like water, fire, and magnets that need to be counteracted with the necessary power-ups. And some have whatever this is. But all of them clearly have a lot of love put into them and are genuinely fun to figure out, though they can get a little bit too long for their own good. The trial and error nature of some situations feels like kind of a bad mix, with the game's complete lack of checkpoints and hit points. One small mistake will immediately undo all the progress you've made and send you all the way back to the beginning of any level. Though once you do know what to do, it doesn't take too long to get back to where you were, and you do have unlimited continues, so I guess it's kind of balanced out. There's also a password system, so you don't need to complete everything in one sitting, and with 144 levels, that's a very good thing. The music here is some of the best on the Lynx. Like Gates of Zendon, there's only a few tunes that tend to get reused a little bit more often than I would like, but it's all really memorable and gives the game a lot of liveliness. The bright visuals and good use of bold colors go well with that too. Now, most would consider this an exclusive to the Lynx, and it kind of is, although there is a Windows version that came out a few years later, though from the looks of it, I'd recommend sticking with this one. Chip's challenge runs smooth, it stays fun, and has almost everything I like about the Lynx on display at all times. Definitely check it out. One of the few good platformers on the Lynx is this rather scaled down but still perfectly playable version of Toki, which is a game I've always been a fan of. This game wound up on a lot of consoles and even has a modern remake that's also pretty good, and while this version might technically be the most inferior one of them all, I still enjoy it. Functionally, almost everything is intact from that superior Genesis version. It's just distilled down to the point where it can actually run on the Lynx. And thanks to it being a fairly slow game with pretty big sprites, it's a good fit for a portable system. Though the scrolling does feel a bit choppy, especially on modern screens where that blurriness of the original LCDs is no longer here to hide it. So if you're emulating it or playing it on an upgraded screen, that will definitely stand out at first. But if my eyes can adjust to it, yours probably can too. And it's worth a try because Toki is a good time no matter where you play it. You upgrade your fire with different weapon types fairly often, and the level layouts change things up regularly too, with more vertical sections, swimming sections that really function more like a shoot 'em up, and of course the occasional boss, which can be anything from a total pushover to outright Souls-like levels of hard. Different power-ups also give Toki different abilities like a high jump, which can send you scrambling looking for the thing that you're meant to jump to before it goes away. Toki is many things, but boring is not one of them. I would also call it a bit on the tougher side, despite being a slower-paced game. Yes, you can take your time with a lot of it, but it still demands quite a bit of precision from the player, both in the shooting and platforming. And before you know it, the game has whittled down your lives and you're back at the beginning. While I would generally recommend the Genesis version over this one if you have the choice, it's still interesting to check this one out, if for nothing else than to just see the differences, and to see how well the fundamentals hold up despite the game being pared back so much. Hydra is one of Atari's many arcade classics that wound up with a Lynx version, and it's also one of the more impressive ports on the system, with a lot of 3D effects like the object scaling in particular, which a lot of Lynx games took advantage of, but it works extremely well here and creates a convincing pseudo 3D effect. Hydra has you speeding down rivers populated with ramps, enemies, money, and checkpoints to replenish your fuel. Most obstacles can be destroyed by your weapons, but it can be kinda tough to aim while navigating the many twists and turns, so I just tend to avoid things whenever possible. Enemies and money can appear in the air too, which you can reach by using your boost, which sends you flying well above the ground for a sustained period. This is fun to do and will maximize your score, but you gotta be careful about where you land. The main goal here, though, is to successfully transport the item given to you at the start of the stage all the way to the end, where the bikini girls will either reward you or shun you like the loser you are. As far as I can tell, the only way to fail at this is to drop the item by getting killed and not pick it back up. Sometimes the guy in the black boat tries to take it from you, so you gotta take him out if he does. Naturally, each level is a little bit more complicated and challenging than the one before, but if you spend your money wisely and upgrade your boat and weapons as needed, you can stay ahead of the curve, though it does get quite hard in the later levels no matter what you do, and in my view, it starts to get a little bit too difficult for its own good, which I guess is typical of these sorts of games. Like a lot of Lynx games though, Hydra is hampered somewhat by some repetition that sets in after a short while. Zooming back and forth between the water and the air is a nice hook for Hydra that sets it apart, at least a little, from the myriad other arcadey water combat games out there, but it's not enough to hold my attention for super long sessions. The bonus stages are a little bit of an attempt to mix things up, but they don't really feel meaningfully different than any other level. The music and sound effects are pretty good overall, although maybe a little bit on the tinny side, with not a whole lot happening on the low end to balance that out, so I turn the volume down when I play this, but that's just me. Despite the repetition though, I like Hydra, and I feel like it's a must-own for the Lynx. While the Lynx version of Ninja Gaiden 1 didn't click with me much at all, Ninja Gaiden 3 is the total opposite, and one of the better games on the system. The Lynx doesn't have a lot of good platformers or side-scrolling games in general, which I think might be part of why it failed, but this is an excellent port of one of the best action platformers of all time. The really nimble movement and tight combat translate pretty well to the Lynx overall, though because of the Lynx's bulkier buttons and bigger design, it does wear out your hands maybe a little bit more than the NES version, in my experience. But if you've got giant hands, it might actually feel like an improvement to you though, since NES controllers sort of have the opposite problem of being kind of small and cramped. Either way though, this is a surprisingly respectable version of an already outstanding game. The precise combat and the platforming definitely put it in the upper tier of difficulty, but it is generally fair. Platforming in this game isn't as straightforward as a lot of other 2D side-scrollers. Climbing up walls and hanging off of ledges are a big part of getting around, so you'll need to really master traversal to get much of anywhere, and believe me when I say, it's not gonna come easy. These games have their own feel to them and really require some time to get good. It's time well spent though. I'd say the visuals and audio are largely on par with the NES version of the game, though there is something about the Lynx sound chip that I find a little bit more appealing than the NES one, but that's just me. The enemies are reasonably varied and keep you on your toes, and a lot of the backgrounds have some nice animation here and there that give them a little bit of personality. Now, I'm not a huge fan of the reddish-brownish color palette of a lot of the backgrounds, but they do manage to stand apart from each other well enough, so I don't know, it's alright. If you've got the skills and/or the patience, then I think Ninja Gaiden 3 has a good shot of being one of your favorite Lynx games. Clax is a ridiculously addictive and rather interesting puzzle game that the Lynx has a uniquely outstanding version of. Here we see a complete devotion to the vertical or tape mode that some Lynx games have as an option, and it fits Clax perfectly. There's also a little intro animation and a theme song that the Genesis and the TurboGrafx versions don't have. Clax is kind of similar to games like Columns and Tetris, but with its own handful of quirks that make it pretty unique. Laying down 3 tiles of the same color vertically, horizontally, or diagonally counts as a Clax and makes them vanish, which creates more room for the other tiles that are tumbling down towards you at all times. Different stages have different objectives though. Sometimes you need to get a certain number of Claxes, and sometimes you just need to reach a certain score, or get rid of a certain amount of tiles in any way. On top of that, the game is always adding more tiles and more color types, making you react quicker and place them smarter. It will put your brain to the test, it will make you feel dumb, and it will quickly become one of your favorite Lynx games if you let it. Retrying levels and being even more efficient with your placements after inevitably losing is an insanely addictive loop, and I think it's rather fun. The game does give you the ability to throw tiles up to the back of the line if you don't know where to put them just yet, but I highly discourage doing that unless you absolutely have to, since it will almost certainly make things harder on you when the tiles come back down in about 7 seconds. The death screams from the other versions of the game are intact here, which is important. Every time you lose a tile, it screams while falling to its death, to fill you with more dread and regret than any puzzle game ever really should. And that gives Clax a little bit of disturbing energy that I really like about it. Other than the intro song in Clax, there isn't much in the way of music, though the rhythm of the tiles tumbling down does create sort of a cadence that builds tension about as well as any song could. Again, I just really love this kind of underlying dread of Clax. And while I still think the TurboGrafx 16 version is probably still my favorite overall, this one is a very close second, and certainly a unique version that fans of the game should definitely check out. The vertical aspect ratio and the unique feel of just playing it on a Lynx make it a pretty standout title for the platform. Zybots is up there with Crystal Mines 2 and Chip's Challenge as one of my absolute favorite titles on the system. It makes really good use of the Lynx's ability to scale images smoothly to create a 3D effect and drive a lot of great music and sound effects through the system's speakers. I highly recommend this one with headphones too, so you can appreciate all the stereo effects and powerful low end that you hear throughout pretty much the whole game. Zybots basically boils down to a fairly simple third-person run-and-gun where you explore corridors in an almost dungeon crawler sort of fashion and blow away robots, or Zybots. It's not a super long or deep game, but there's more than enough here to occupy you for at least a couple hours or so, no problem. Lots of secret areas, explorable levels, and warp zones that add to the variety quite a bit. Collecting coins from defeated Zybots will allow you to buy weapon upgrades and various abilities between levels. Like my personal favorite, the ability to reflect a set amount of enemy fire back at them. Being aggressive is generally rewarded in Zybots, but on the flip side of that, if you die, you're done. All the way back to the beginning with you, and that can feel pretty brutal when it happens. But thanks to the different paths that you can take by exploring the corridors of every stage, and the different strategies you can employ from experimenting with different items in the shop, subsequent attempts can feel pretty different from each other. Keeping at least a couple of keys in your inventory is always worth doing, since they usually lead to warps that can let you skip multiple levels at a time. Also, don't forget to check your map every now and then, as it lets you know where enemies and exits are, which is pretty valuable. You also have a zap ability at your disposal, which, as far as I can tell, just freezes the enemies in place, allowing you to shoot them that much easier. Although it does suck a lot of energy from you, making it more of a Hail Mary than anything, because, again, preserving every last drop of energy is important, since this is essentially a permadeath game. And you'll need to be able to take at least a couple of hits when facing the Master Zybot, which shows up a few times throughout the game. Most of the great animation work from the arcade version makes it to this one, so it does have a nice polish to it visually. The tight controls back that up to make an extremely well-made game all around here. A little more visual variety in the level designs would have gone a long way to maybe breaking up that sort of clinical look that a lot of them have, but overall I find the graphics quite nice. The character and the enemy designs in particular have a lot of charm to them and largely keep things mixed up enough that Zybots avoids a lot of the repetition of its peers. I can play it for well over an hour easily before I start feeling like I want to switch to something else, which is well above average for the Lynx library. The entire game is probably about 3 to 4 hours, so if you want to plow through it, you definitely can, though you may want to go with an AC adapter, since the 6AA batteries last barely that long. Zybots is a class act. It's an extremely well-rounded game and a fantastic choice for anybody looking to add some high-quality games to their Lynx library. It's also one of the few games on the Lynx that has a 2-player co-op mode, so if you've got 2 Lynxes and one of those COM Lynx cables, you and a friend can go to town on some Zybots together. And if your friend isn't interested in that, then maybe they shouldn't be your friend, I don't know. Something to think about. Now I know there's a bunch of Lynx games that definitely could have earned a spot in this video, and if this video doesn't totally bomb, then maybe I'll do a part 2 like I did with the TurboGrafx. Either way though, I'm happy to shine a light on the Lynx in any capacity because I think there's a lot of quality games here. But let me know which Lynx games are your favorite. There's still a few in the library I think I haven't played yet, so let me know if there's some other ones that maybe I should check out, and until then, thanks for watching.